Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. Before we begin, I'd like you to do something for me. If you're comfortable doing so, I'd like you to close your eyes and I'd like you to picture a child. Maybe it's your son, maybe it's your daughter, maybe it's your grandchild, maybe it's a child you care for. Picture their face. Picture their smile. Picture the things that make them uniquely them. Their strengths, their quirks, the things that make them special. Now I'd like you to picture the last time that child became overwhelmed. Perhaps they shouted. Perhaps they screamed. Perhaps they cried. Perhaps they hid. Perhaps they slammed a door. Perhaps they hit. Perhaps they completely shut down. And perhaps afterwards they said, I don't know why I did that. Or perhaps they couldn't explain it at all. Keep that child in your mind throughout today's talk, because that child is why we're here. Not because they're naughty, not because they're manipulative, not because they're seeking attention, but because they are loved and because we want them to thrive. You can open your eyes. Quick show of hands, how many people here have ever walked away from one of your child's emotional explosions and thought, what on earth just happened? How many people have ever replayed it in your mind afterwards and wondered, could I have handled that differently? How many people have ever lost your own temper and then felt guilty afterwards? Thank you. Look around the room. You're not alone. Oh, and before we keep going, I'm Dr. Harry Woodward. In case you don't know me, I'm a consultant paediatrician, and this is the kind of thing that I do every day. Over the years, I've met thousands of families, and one of the commonest things parents say to me is, Doctor, my child goes from 0 to 100 in seconds. Or, he melts down over the smallest things. Or, she keeps it together all day and then explodes as soon as she gets home. And many parents quietly ask themselves, am I doing something wrong? And I want to start by reassuring you, you are probably doing a better job than you think. I have to confess that emotional regulation is one of the spokes on the wheel that I personally find hardest. There have absolutely been moments as a parent when I have not responded in the way I would have wanted. Moments when I have become frustrated. Moments when I have tried to reason with a child who was far too overwhelmed to listen. Moments when afterwards I have reflected and thought, I got that wrong. Parenting is humbling, wonderfully humbling, and parenting neurodivergent children can be even more so. Before I had children, I understood emotional regulation intellectually. After becoming a parent, I understood it emotionally, and those two are very different things. My hope for today is not that you leave here able to prevent every meltdown. You won't. None of us can. My hope is that you leave with something much more important. Understanding, confidence, and hope. Because when we understand behaviour differently, we respond differently. And understanding changes everything. And that is what today's talk is all about. So why does emotional regulation matter so much? Because emotional regulation affects almost every aspect of a child's life. It affects learning, it affects friendships, it affects family relationships, it affects confidence, it affects anxiety, it affects behaviour, and ultimately it affects how children feel about themselves. I sometimes think of emotional regulation as the emotional foundations of a house. If the foundations are strong, children can usually cope with life's inevitable ups and downs, disappointment, frustration, change, conflict, mistakes. But if those foundations are shaky, cracks begin to appear everywhere, at school, at home, in friendships, in family life. Quick show of hands, how many people here are better at regulating your emotions when you are well rested, well fed, and not stressed? Exactly. Now, how many people are at their very best when you are hungry, tired, running late, and somebody criticises you? Not many of us. And yet many of our children are trying to regulate big feelings whilst feeling anxious, feeling overwhelmed, feeling misunderstood, feeling exhausted, and trying to meet demands that may already exceed their capacity. I remember meeting one family whose main concern was behaviour. Their son was having explosive outbursts at home. School were becoming increasingly concerned. Siblings were frightened. The whole family felt as though they were walking on eggshells. The parents told me it's like living with a volcano. But as we explored things further, something became clear. This child wasn't choosing to explode. He wasn't waking up in the morning thinking, how can I make everybody's life difficult today? He was overwhelmed. His emotional bucket was overflowing. And once the family understood that, everything changed. The behaviour didn't disappear overnight, but their response changed. There was less blame, more curiosity, less punishment, more support, and things gradually improved. One day, the parent said something that has stayed with me. They said, "For the first time, I realised he wasn't giving me a hard time. He was having a hard time." I think that sentence captures emotional regulation beautifully. Children do well when they can, and when they can't, it is our job to become curious rather than critical. Because behaviour is communication, always. Sometimes children communicate with words, sometimes with tears, sometimes with aggression, sometimes by withdrawing, sometimes by shutting down completely. And if behaviour is communication, our job is not simply to stop the behaviour. Our job is to understand what the behaviour is telling us. So if I could leave you with one message from this section, it would be this. Children are not giving us a hard time. They are having a hard time, and understanding changes everything. So, if emotional regulation affects so many areas of family life, how do we begin to understand it? Well, just like sleep, emotional regulation is not one thing, it is many things. And that brings us to the emotional regulation confidence wheel. So let's move on to the first spoke, recognizing emotions. Because before children can manage feelings, they must first need to recognize them. And I think this is something that many of us take for granted. As adults, most of us can usually tell when we're feeling angry, or worried, or disappointed, or overwhelmed, but many children can't. Quick show of hands, how many people here have ever asked your child, "How are you feeling?" And they've replied, "I don't know." Yes, me too. Or perhaps you've said, "What's wrong?" And the answer has been, "Nothing." Even though it is very obvious that something is wrong. I remember meeting one young person who could identify only two emotions, fine and angry. That was it. Everything else was angry. Anxious? Angry. Embarrassed? Angry. Disappointed? Angry. Overwhelmed? Angry. Sad? Angry. And when we started to explore emotions in more detail, something remarkable happened. As this young person developed a richer emotional vocabulary, their behaviour began to change. Because they could finally say, "I'm worried, I'm embarrassed, I'm overwhelmed, I need a break." And when children can tell us what is happening inside them, they no longer need to communicate everything through behaviour. I think one of the most important things we can teach children is this. All feelings are okay, but not all behaviours are okay. Because emotions are information. They tell us something important. Anger might tell us something feels unfair. Anxiety might tell us something feels unsafe. Sadness might tell us something important has been lost. Frustration might tell us something is hard. Now, emotions don't just happen in our minds, they happen in our bodies too. When I'm anxious, I often notice it physically before I notice it emotionally. Perhaps my shoulders tense. Perhaps my heart beats faster. Perhaps I feel restless. I suspect many of you recognize that too. Children experience exactly the same thing, but many children do not yet recognize the body's warning signs. They don't notice the clenched fists, the tight tummy, the racing heart, the hot face, the tense shoulders, and by the time they realize something is wrong, they are already overwhelmed. This is particularly true for many neurodivergent children. Some children experience emotions very intensely. Others struggle to identify emotions at all. And some children simply have fewer words available to describe what they are feeling. So how can we help? Firstly, by naming emotions, not just the difficult emotions, all emotions. Excited, proud, nervous, disappointed, embarrassed, jealous, frustrated. Secondly, by modelling emotional language ourselves, saying things like, "I'm feeling a little overwhelmed today. I'm frustrated, so I'm going to take a few deep breaths. I'm disappointed, but I'll be okay." Children learn emotional language from us. And thirdly, by helping children notice what emotions feel like in their bodies, because you cannot regulate an emotion that you cannot recognize. So, if I could leave you with one message from this section, it would be this. You cannot regulate an emotion that you cannot recognize. And once children begin to recognize emotions, the next question becomes, what causes those emotions in the first place? Which brings us to our next spoke, triggers. So let's move on to the second spoke, triggers. Now, I suspect many of you have experienced this. Your child appears absolutely fine, and then suddenly everything falls apart. An explosion, tears, shouting, a meltdown. And as parents, we often find ourselves thinking that came completely out of nowhere. Quick show of hands, who has noticed exactly that? Yes, most of us. I remember one family describing a huge emotional explosion because toast had been cut into triangles instead of rectangles. The parents were understandably bewildered. They thought, surely this can't really be about toast. And they were right. It wasn't about toast. It was never about toast. The toast was simply the final straw, the final drop in an already overflowing bucket. I often ask families to think of emotional regulation like a volcano. What we see is the eruption, the shouting, the crying, the aggression, the meltdown. But long before the eruption, pressure has been building underneath the surface. Perhaps the child didn't sleep well. Perhaps they were anxious about school. Perhaps the classroom was too noisy. Perhaps they were hungry. Perhaps they had worked incredibly hard to hold things together all day. Perhaps there were too many demands, too many transitions, too many sensory challenges. By the time the toast appeared, the volcano was already full. And this is one of the biggest shifts I would love parents to make. Instead of asking, why did my child explode over something so small? Try asking, what happened before this? Because meltdowns rarely come out of nowhere. They come out of overwhelm. Common triggers include hunger, tiredness, sensory overload, transitions, unexpected change, demands, uncertainty, social difficulties, feeling criticized, feeling misunderstood. I think becoming a parent has taught me something important. Very often, behaviour makes much more sense when we look at the whole day rather than the final 5 minutes. One of the most helpful tools families can use is a trigger diary. Simply keeping a note of what happened, when did it happen, who was there, what happened beforehand, what patterns are emerging. Because patterns are powerful. Patterns allow us to predict, and prediction allows us to prepare, and preparation prevents overwhelm. So if I could leave you with one message from this section, it would be this. Meltdowns rarely come out of nowhere. They come out of overwhelm. And if we can understand the triggers, we can often prevent the eruption. Which brings us to our next spoke, ADHD and autism brain differences. Now, I think this section is incredibly important because many parents of neurodivergent children spend years wondering, why does my child react so strongly? Or, why does such a small thing create such a big reaction? And sometimes they begin to wonder whether their child is simply being dramatic or overreacting. I want to reassure you, very often they aren't. Their brain is simply processing emotions differently. Quick show of hands. How many people here have ever looked at your child's reaction to something and thought, that feels much bigger than the situation itself. Yes? Many parents recognize that. One of the things we know about ADHD is that emotions can arrive quickly, intensely, and sometimes unexpectedly. Many children with ADHD experience emotions in high definition. They feel things deeply, and they often react before they have had time to think. I sometimes explain it to families like this. Imagine driving a car. Most of us have both an accelerator and brakes. For many children with ADHD, the emotional accelerator is very powerful, but the brakes are still developing. So emotions can go from 0 to 100 very quickly. That doesn't mean children with ADHD have bigger emotions. It may simply mean that they have fewer brakes. Many children with ADHD also struggle to recover emotionally. Parents often tell me, "Doctor, everybody else has moved on, but my child is still upset 3 hours later." Or, once he's upset, it takes ages for him to calm down. Again, this is incredibly common. Recovery can be slower, and children often need more support from adults during this process. Another important concept is rejection sensitivity. Many neurodivergent children are exquisitely sensitive to criticism. Something that another child might shrug off can feel devastating. A correction from a teacher, not being invited to a party, losing a game, a friendship difficulty. These experiences can trigger very big emotional responses. I remember one young person who came home from school absolutely distraught because a friend had chosen to sit next to somebody else at lunch. The family initially struggled to understand why this seemed so upsetting, but for that young person, it felt catastrophic. Once the family understood this, they were able to respond very differently, less with "don't be silly" and more with "that sounds really hard." Understanding changed everything. Autistic children may experience emotions differently for other reasons. Many autistic children experience emotions intensely. They may find uncertainty difficult, unexpected change difficult, social interactions exhausting, sensory experiences overwhelming, and many autistic children work incredibly hard to mask throughout the school day. They hold it together, they cope, they keep going, and then they come home and completely fall apart. I suspect many people in this room recognise that pattern. School says they've been absolutely fine all day, and parents think, are we talking about the same child? But there is a very important reason for this. Home is often the safest place to fall apart. I think that is one of the most important messages I can give to parents. Sometimes the reason children explode at home is not because you are doing something wrong. It is because home is the place where they finally feel safe enough to let go. I think becoming a parent has also taught me just how easy it is to compare ourselves with other families. It's very easy to look at another family and think, why does bedtime seem easier for them? Why don't their children react like this? What are they doing that we're not? But children are different, families are different, and one of the most important lessons I have learned, both as a doctor and as a parent, is this: no two children develop the same way, and understanding helps far more than comparison ever will. So if I could leave you with one message from this section, it would be this. Neurodivergent children are not choosing to feel emotions more intensely. Their brains simply experience emotions differently. And when we understand that, we begin to respond differently, with curiosity, with compassion, and with support. Because emotional intensity and anxiety often go hand in hand, which brings us neatly to our next spoke, anxiety and overwhelm. I think anxiety is one of the most important and often overlooked drivers of emotional dysregulation, because anxious children are often overwhelmed children, and overwhelmed children struggle to regulate. Quick show of hands, how many people here have ever noticed that your child's emotional regulation becomes worse when they are anxious? Exactly. You're not imagining it. I sometimes say that anxiety acts like emotional fuel. It pours petrol onto an already smouldering fire, and suddenly things that might normally feel manageable become overwhelming. I remember meeting one young person who appeared to have emotional outbursts for no apparent reason. Parents, school, everybody was puzzled. But as we explored things further, a very different picture emerged. This child was spending every school day trying desperately to appear okay, trying to say the right thing, trying to fit in, trying not to make mistakes, trying not to stand out. By the time they got home, they were utterly exhausted. And then something very small would happen. The wrong meal, a request to do homework, a sibling touching something, and everything would explode. The emotional explosion wasn't the problem. It was simply the final sign that the child had reached their limit. Many children experience significant anxiety related to uncertainty, related to perfectionism, social situations, school demands, transitions, sensory experiences, making mistakes, or simply trying to meet expectations that feel impossible. I think one of the commonest things I hear from children is this: what if I get it wrong? And when children spend all day worrying about getting things wrong, emotional regulation becomes incredibly difficult. Many neurodivergent children also engage in masking. They hide difficulties, copy other children, suppress emotions, work incredibly hard to appear fine. And whilst masking can sometimes help children cope socially, it comes at a cost. Masking is exhausting, which is why I often say sometimes the safest place to fall apart is home. Parents sometimes tell me, why do they save their worst behaviour for me? And my answer is usually because you are their safe place, because they trust you, because they know that your love is not conditional. That doesn't make the behaviour easy, but understanding it can make it feel less personal. So, what helps? Firstly, reducing unnecessary demands when children are overwhelmed. Secondly, increasing predictability. Thirdly, helping children identify worries before they become crises. And fourthly, remembering that anxious children rarely need more pressure, they need more support. So if I could leave you with one message from this section, it would be this: anxious children are not trying to make life difficult. They are having a difficult time. And understanding that changes everything. Which brings us to one of the most important sections of today's talk: meltdowns and shutdowns. I think this may be one of the most important sections of today's talk because many parents come to clinic and say, "Doctor, I don't know what to do when my child melts down." Or it's like they become a completely different person. Or nothing I do seems to help. Quick show of hands. How many people here have ever tried reasoning with a child during a meltdown? Yes, me too. How many people here have ever found yourself saying things like, "Calm down, use your words, there's no need to get upset"? Again, me too. And if I'm honest, there have been moments as a parent when I have absolutely tried to reason with a child who was far too overwhelmed to listen. Moments when afterwards I reflected and thought, I got that wrong. Because when children are overwhelmed, logic goes offline. I think one of the most helpful things parents can understand is the difference between tantrums, meltdowns, and shutdowns, because they are not the same. A tantrum usually has a purpose. A child wants something or wants to avoid something, and if the goal changes, the behaviour often changes. A meltdown is different. A meltdown occurs when a child becomes completely overwhelmed, emotionally, sensory-wise, cognitively. Their brain becomes overloaded and they lose the ability to cope. At that point, the behaviour is not deliberate. The child is not choosing to be difficult. They are overwhelmed. A shutdown is different again. Instead of exploding outwards, the child implodes. They may become silent, withdrawn, hide, freeze, become unable to communicate, or appear emotionally absent. I think shutdowns are particularly easy to miss because quiet children often attract less attention, but shutdowns can be every bit as distressing as meltdowns. I remember meeting one young person whose parents described emotional explosions that seemed to appear from nowhere. As we explored things further, we realised that this child had been coping with increasing levels of overwhelm for hours. By the time the meltdown happened, there was no capacity left. The meltdown wasn't the beginning of the problem, it was the end point. So, what should we do during a meltdown? Firstly, safety comes first. Keep everybody safe, including yourself. Secondly, reduce language. When children are overwhelmed, long explanations rarely help. Keep language simple, short, calm, predictable. Thirdly, reduce demands. This is not the moment to teach, not the moment to lecture or to impose consequences. And fourthly, wait, because emotional storms pass. I think one of the most important lessons I can give you today is this. A dysregulated child cannot access logic, or to put it another way, regulation comes before reasoning. Trying to reason with a child in the middle of a meltdown is a little bit like trying to teach somebody to swim whilst they are drowning. The teaching comes later, once calm has returned. So if I could leave you with one message from this section, it would be this. Regulation comes before reasoning. And if children cannot regulate by themselves, how do they learn? The answer is through something called co-regulation, which brings us to our next spoke. I think this may be the most important spoke on the entire wheel, co-regulation, because children do not learn emotional regulation in isolation. They learn it through relationships. Quick show of hands. How many people here have ever found yourself becoming dysregulated when your child is dysregulated? Thank you for your honesty. Again, me too. I think one of the most humbling things about parenting is that our children have an extraordinary ability to activate our own emotions: fear, frustration, anger, helplessness, exhaustion. And yet, when children are overwhelmed, they often need us to lend them our calm. I sometimes explain co-regulation like this. When children are young, they borrow regulation from adults. Over time, and with repeated experiences, they gradually develop the ability to regulate themselves. But before children can self-regulate, they first need to be co-regulated. Children borrow our calm before they develop their own. Now, I want to tell you a story. One morning, my child came downstairs dressed for school. The problem, it was fencing day, and he needed to be dressed in his fencing kit, not his school uniform. My immediate instinct was to correct him. No, but then I caught myself, because what my child had actually done was something rather wonderful. They had got themselves ready independently. And if I had trusted my first instinct and gone with correction first, I would have missed that opportunity to connect. I didn't teach anything in that moment. I didn't correct anything. I lent my child my calm until they could find their own. That is co-regulation. Now, please don't misunderstand me. I do not get this right all the time. Far from it. There have absolutely been moments when I've found myself becoming frustrated. Moments when I've reacted rather than responded. Moments when I have reflected afterwards and thought, I wish I'd handled that differently. Parenting is humbling, wonderfully humbling. But I've learned something important. Children rarely learn emotional regulation from our best lectures. They learn it from our repeated experiences of staying alongside them when emotions are hard. Co-regulation does not mean allowing everything. It does not mean having no boundaries. It does not mean never saying no. It means staying connected whilst holding boundaries. Practical examples include lowering your voice, reducing language, getting alongside rather than standing over, validating feelings. I can see you're really upset. This really feels hard right now. I'm here. And perhaps most importantly, repair, because all parents get it wrong. All of us. The goal is not perfection. The goal is repair. Some of the most powerful conversations happen after things have gone wrong. I'm sorry. I got that wrong. Let's think together about what we can do differently next time. And if I could leave you with one message from this section, it would be this. Children borrow our calm before they develop their own. And emotional regulation is not something we do to children, it is something we build with them. Which brings us to our next spoke, building emotional regulation skills. So let's move on to the seventh spoke, building emotional regulation skills. Now, I think this section is enormously hopeful because emotional regulation is not something children either have or don't have. Emotional regulation is a skill, and skills can grow. Quick show of hands, how many people here have ever tried teaching a child emotional regulation in the middle of a meltdown? Again, me too. And if I'm honest, it almost never goes well. Because skills are not built during moments of crisis. Skills are built during moments of calm. And I often explain it like this. If I wanted to teach somebody to swim, I wouldn't wait until they were drowning. I would teach them when they were calm, safe, and able to learn. Emotional regulation is exactly the same. Many parents understandably focus all of their energy on managing emotional explosions. But if we want emotional regulation to improve, we need to spend just as much time building skills when children are calm. What sort of skills? Firstly, recognizing emotions, which we have already discussed. Secondly, identifying body signals. What does anger feel like? What does anxiety feel like? What does overwhelm feel like? And thirdly, developing coping strategies, deep breathing, movement, sensory strategies, taking a break, listening to music, using a calm corner, asking for help, problem solving. I think one of the biggest mistakes we make is expecting children to automatically know how to calm themselves. Most adults struggle to calm themselves sometimes. Why would we expect children to find it easy? I remember one young person who could tell everybody exactly what they should do when they felt angry. Deep breathing, walk away, ask for help. The difficulty was that they couldn't access any of those strategies when emotions became intense. So we practiced again and again and again when calm, because repetition builds pathways. I often say to families, children do not rise to the level of our expectations. They fall to the level of their practice. And emotional regulation skills need practice, lots of practice. I think another important message is this: different children need different strategies. Some children need movement. Some need sensory input. Some need quiet. Some need connection. Some need humour. There is no universal strategy. The goal is to help children discover what works for them. And perhaps most importantly of all, celebrate progress, not perfection, because emotional regulation rarely improves in a straight line. There will be good days. There will be difficult days. There will be setbacks. That is normal. That is how learning happens. So if I could leave you with one message from this section, it would be this: skills are built during calm moments, not crisis moments, and every moment of practice matters. Which brings us to our final spoke: support and treatment. So let's move on to the final spoke: support and treatment. And I think this may be one of the most important sections of today's talk, because I know there will be some parents sitting here thinking, we've tried everything, we've read the books, we've changed our parenting, we've spoken to school, and we're still struggling. If that's you, I want to say something very clearly. You have not failed. Can I ask for a quick show of hands? How many people here have ever worried that you are somehow getting this parenting thing wrong? Thank you. Again, you're not alone. Parenting neurodivergent children can be incredibly rewarding, but it can also be exhausting, emotionally exhausting, and there is no prize for struggling alone. Sometimes children need additional support, and sometimes families need additional support. That is not failure, that is wisdom. Support can take many forms: school support, reasonable adjustments, therapeutic support, parenting support, parent training, psychology, occupational therapy, speech and language therapy, support groups, community. And sometimes, particularly when ADHD, anxiety, or significant emotional dysregulation are present, medication may have an important role. Now, medication does not teach emotional regulation, but for some children, medication can reduce some of the barriers that make emotional regulation difficult. For example, improving attention, reducing impulsivity, reducing anxiety, improving sleep, creating more opportunities for success. I think it's really important that parents do not view support as weakness, because asking for help is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of wisdom. One of the things that struck me after years of doing this work is that parents are often incredibly compassionate towards their children, but much less compassionate towards themselves. So I want to say this: please be kind to yourselves. You are raising children with beautifully unique brains. That is a privilege, but it can also be hard, very hard, and you do not have to do it alone. Support exists, hope exists, and things can improve. Because emotional regulation is not fixed. Brains change, skills grow, families grow, confidence grows, and that brings us to the end of our journey around the emotional regulation confidence wheel. So as we come towards the end of our time together today, I'd like you to look back at the emotional regulation confidence wheel one last time. At first glance, it can feel overwhelming. 8 spokes, 8 areas to think about, 8 possible reasons why children struggle with big feelings. But I don't want you to leave today thinking that you need to fix all 8. You don't. In fact, I'd encourage you not to try. Instead, I'd like you to think about the child you pictured at the beginning. Picture them again, their face, their smile, their strengths, the things that make them uniquely them. Now look at the wheel. Without overthinking it, point to the spoke that feels most relevant to your family right now. Keep your finger there. That's your starting point. Not 8 spokes, 1. Just 1. Because confidence is not built by trying to do everything. Confidence is built one conversation at a time, one repaired relationship, one calmer response, one moment of connection, one small success. That is how families move from chaos to confidence, one spoke at a time. And I want to leave you with one last thought. Earlier, I said that children borrow our calm before they develop their own. I'd like you to hold on to that because it means something quite remarkable. Every time you stay alongside your child on a hard night, every time you lower your voice instead of raising it, every time you choose connection before correction, even the times you get it wrong and come back and repair it, you are not just getting through the evening, you are lending them a calm they will one day carry for themselves. The calm you bring tonight becomes the calm they grow into. So on the hard evenings, and there will be hard evenings, I hope you remember that none of it is wasted. You are building something one ordinary night at a time. Be kind to yourselves. You're doing a better job than you think, and you do not have to do it alone. Before you leave today, let me ask you one thing. Of the 8 spokes on that wheel, how many feel relevant to your family? Maybe 2, maybe 3. Now, which one would change the most if it got a little easier this week? Hold that spoke in mind, because in less than a minute, you can walk out of here with the tools for that exact spoke. So please take out your phone and scan the QR code on the screen. When you scan the code, you'll receive my Emotional Regulation Starter Pack. Inside, you'll find practical tools to help you get started straight away, including the Emotional Regulation Confidence Wheel, a Feelings Vocabulary Pack, a Trigger Detective Worksheet, a Meltdown and Shutdown Guide, a Co-Regulation Cheat Sheet, a Calm Plan Template, and practical strategies you can begin using tonight. There is no pressure, no obligation, just support. Because exhausted families do not need judgment. They need understanding. They need support. And they need hope. Thank you so much for taking the time to spend it with me today. I really do appreciate it, and I wish you and your family every success in your journey from chaos to confidence.